Good evening.
Good evening, folks. Good to see you all.
Good to see you. Today we will be talking about resentfulness. It is the next module in our BPS approved certificate in working with common life challenges or non-diagnostic psychological problems. And it was very interesting. In one of the previous Thursdays, somebody commented that they really like this certificate because 90% of their clients, first of all, come with this common life challenges or common non-diagnostic problems like jealousy, like perfectionism, imposter syndrome, procrastination, resentfulness, hurt. And that's why we've decided to create this certificate. This certificate consists of a number of modules, and some of them already have taken place, but they're all available as recordings. So if you are considering doing the whole certificate, you can. Even though you've missed some of the modules, you still can do them because they are available as full recordings. And this short 2-hour sort of masterclass type modules actually lend themselves very well to recordings because obviously in 2 hours we can't do too many exercises. So it is quite sufficient to watch them as a recording, although of course coming live is the best option. Okay, so now I'm very happy to introduce to you Professor Paul Grantham. He is my co-director and he's a founder of SDS training company, SDS seminars. And today we will be talking about resentfulness. Paul, welcome, first of all.
Thanks very much, Julia.
And I want to ask you, before we go into deeper into the topic, resentfulness, resentment, hurt, anger, bitterness, what exactly we're talking about? Are all these terms interchangeable, or at least what is your interpretation of those?
Right. Well, actually, to some extent, this sort of goes to the nub of the problem, really, with this particular difficulty. Let me just say a few things about it. Let's distinguish, first of all, between resentment and resentfulness. Maybe it's self-evident to say, but they are actually slightly different in that resentfulness is about a state of being full of resentment. And, you know, I think to some degree it's not dissimilar to the idea of someone feeling anxious in a particular situation, and that being different from an anxious person. So in many ways, I think resentfulness is about resentment being an overwhelming and defining feature of who you actually are and what your actual experience is. I'll end up using the two terms sort of interchangeably, but I think that's the first thing to say. And then we got this interesting question about, you know, is it the same as or different from some of these other things that you actually mentioned? The first thing that's really interesting about this is if you go and look at dictionary definitions of resentfulness or resentment, I think probably more than any other psychological difficulty I've come across, to be honest with you, there is a striking lack of consensus about what this term actually means. So just at a dictionary definition level, I mean, in some instances, it's sort of described as a feeling of lingering ill will. In others, it's defined as being a displeasure or annoyance. And that, not surprisingly, shades into anger, and particularly anger following hurt. But I hope you can see just from those dictionary definition elements to things that this is not actually as straightforward and focused as a lot of other emotional problems actually have. And I think that a sort of key thing that I want to be opening up certainly when we look at this in more detail tomorrow, is that it shades into and overlaps with quite an interesting range of different emotions, which frequently coexist or are present at the same time that as resentment is, or resentfulness is. So there's certainly an overlap with guilt, for example. And although guilt is not synonymous with resentfulness, it shades in or is often present at the same time. Feelings of disappointment. In some folks, feelings of disgust as well. Also, not surprisingly, and this is one of the reasons why this sort of title or subtitle is included in brackets, there's obviously a sensation or a feeling of hurt. Obviously an overlap with anger. And I'll come back to that particular point in a minute, because, you know, how resentfulness is actually the same as or different from anger is quite an important point. Overlaps, as you've already mentioned, and it's one of the reasons why I think that this is a key follow-up really to jealousy, is it often overlaps with jealousy, with bitterness, and that wonderful sort of German term to describe that state of Schadenfreude, of pleasure in something not going right for somebody. I remember having a client who was extraordinarily resentful and bitter towards her ex-partner. And I remember her coming along one day to one of our sessions, and she had this broad smile on her face, and I asked her what had changed, and because that was not the way in which she normally presented. And what had actually happened was she'd got some news that her ex-partner's new partner had ended the relationship with him, and that he was actually bereft by that. And she just seemed to get enormous pleasure from that. Interestingly enough, and we'll come back to this point in a minute, interestingly enough, although she got pleasure from his distress and displeasure, it didn't actually reduce her feelings of resentfulness. So there wasn't, and I think this is quite important, there wasn't any cathartic advantage for her of that actually occurring. So we're looking at a lot of very related but quite different emotions. So a few things to sort of pull out from this, which again I will be looking at in more detail tomorrow. I think one of the interesting things about it is that resentfulness can be both an expression of what's called hot anger as well as cold anger. So it can, for example, overlap with a propensity for temper loss. So you know, people who are, I'm sure that many of us have come across folks who are particularly resentful and have a low threshold for exploding or losing their temper or shouting or whatever. But it also can be an expression of cold anger as well, of a held-inness regarding the anger, and also almost a sense that the anger is quite cognitive, which I think is a really important feature to it, really. In fact, I think one of the most defining things about resentfulness, and absolutely central to it, and which makes it in many ways different from anger as an emotion generally, is that there is an enormous amount of cognitive rumination in it. So generally speaking, I think that it's probably the most cognitive expression of anger. Individuals will run through in their heads particularly visual images of past hurt or past insult, and that preoccupies them, and obviously provides a direct route into what it is that they're actually feeling as well. And I'll come back to that point in a minute, because it's one of the things I think which actually differentiates it from what might be commonly termed hot or explosive anger. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that commonly with anger problems, perceived unfairness is an extremely common route that people actually have into feeling angry. But what I want to emphasize is it's not the only route into feeling angry. So for example, frustration is also a route into feeling angry. But I think the thing to bear in mind about resentfulness is that perceived unfairness is absolutely integral. It's not one particular route into feeling resentful. It is the only route into feeling resentful. So that whole idea about being treated unfairly, about being at the receiving end of something which is experienced as being morally objectionable, is absolutely central to the particular problem. So that and the rumination part, I'll actually be opening up in a lot more detail tomorrow. So I'm sorry to have sort of gone on about that a bit longer than I anticipated, but I just really wanted to emphasize the complexity of this. Actually, this is in a peculiar way one of the most complex emotions to actually work with people on. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I know you've answered this, but Bev is asking you to repeat. What is the difference exactly between resentment and resentfulness?
Between resentment and resentfulness.
Yes,
okay.
She can't quite get her head around it.
So resentment is an emotional cognitive reaction that one has. So I don't know, somebody has got a promotion at work, and I thought I should have had that promotion. I didn't get that promotion. This other person has got it. And as a result of that, I resent that fact. That's not necessarily the same as me being resentful, however. So being resentful is much more about where resentment becomes part of your personal identity. In fact, and we will come onto this in quite a bit of detail tomorrow, because that's often where it creates some of the biggest problems. That people in many ways start defining themselves by their resentment. And as I say, I'll come on to that tomorrow, but just if I can just illustrate a little bit about why that is so important. Apart from, the fact that it's going to influence a wide range of situations and settings which I might come across. I'll have a low threshold. If I see myself in this way, I'll have a low threshold to cross over, to feel resentful in a number of situations. But I think the other key thing about it is that it actually has some very big motivational implications. Because you would think at first sight, wouldn't you, that nobody would want to be resentful. But actually, that's not quite true. In reality, resentfulness has got an attraction for people, which again, I'll come back to tomorrow. I might say a little bit about it now, but certainly we'll be looking at it in more detail tomorrow. So resentfulness is about a state, typically, which we define ourselves by, and which affects our attitude to a wide variety of things. To experience resentment is something which is much more specific to, in many ways, it's a natural emotional reaction, which we might have to certain circumstances, but which doesn't define us or dominate our thinking in the same way that resentfulness does.
Can I just ask you, I guess it's not very common for a client to come to a therapist and say, I suffer from resentfulness.
Yeah,
I don't think it's a very common complaint. So how does the therapist make the decision that that needs to be a focus of their therapeutic work?
Right, there's a couple of issues in what you're actually highlighting. Let's deal with the first one, which you quite rightly highlight, which is, I think it's pretty unusual for clients to come along and say, I've got a problem with being resentful. And one of the things that's quite interesting about resentfulness is that the level of awareness that individuals have of their own resentfulness in comparison with other types of emotional problems is pretty low. It's not unique. It's not unique. I probably come across quite a substantial proportion of people, for instance, who've got anger problems, who would not come along and say, I have got an anger problem. But they might say somebody else thinks I've got an anger problem. But they, you get a lot of people with anger problems who don't actually think they've got an anger problem. But I would say that people coming along saying, I feel eaten up by resentment, or I'm a resentful person and I want to try and deal with it, is even rarer. So the implication of that, can I just say, is there often needs to be some work in terms of raising self-awareness and enabling the client to discover whether this is a part of their being. So what that will mean, obviously, is that the client's probably going to come along to us with some other type of presenting problem. So they will say, I can't get over such and such. I can't get over the fact that my partner has left me, for instance, is maybe the way in which they might actually present it. Now, coming on to the second sort of question that you asked, which is bearing in mind that people don't come along with this. And in addition to that, the fact that resentfulness is such a complex emotion, how do you make a decision about whether you're going to focus on that, for example, rather than jealousy, or focus on guilt, or something else? And the brief answer is that I think that this all is determined by two things. The first one is how the client wishes to frame their distress. And, the emotions are not mutually incompatible. We've identified the fact it's quite possible to be feeling resentful and to be feeling guilty and to be feeling jealous. So it's not like, in a sense, it's one or the other. These coexist frequently for folks. So to some degree, it's determined, I think, by what the client sees as the priority that they want to address. But the other thing I would bear in mind is, although the client may not necessarily be aware of it, I'm very interested indeed in what aspect of the client's distress basically interferes the most with their functioning. What dominates their thinking the most, and what is interfering with their ability to live their life. And I can say to you now that, if you're going to create, or if you're going to treat resentfulness as being the priority of the therapeutic work that you're going to do, you should be typically expecting to see a high proportion of time by the client being spent on rumination of past hurt, and where the focus of their feeling is primarily directed towards the individual that they perceive as having created that particular hurt. Now that's, and can I just give you a distinction here just to illustrate this? Resentfulness is, for example, something that can crop up, not surprisingly, with people who have been sexually abused. Now, in that sort of context, I can react in a whole variety of different ways to the fact that I've been abused. And I can have a different focus on what particular aspects of my reaction create the most distress for me. For some people, it will be a rumination, which is full of resentment towards the abuser. In other instances, the focus for the individual will be feeling incredibly guilty that they either allowed this to happen, or that they failed to protect other siblings who were also abused, and that it's the guilt that is the primary focus for their attention. So in a sense, what I would say with this is take the lead from your client on it, but also allow the client and yourself to collaboratively explore how the past hurt is significantly interfering with the person's life now. And rather than, and I think this is an important point, making a priori assumptions or decisions about, in inverted commas, what the real problem actually is. So I know that it's not as definitive as it might be, but I hope that gives some guidelines in terms of what you focus on. And it is undoubtedly a complicated question, because this is not a straightforward emotional state to be dealing with. So yeah, I hope that gives at least some pointers in terms of the way in which you might actually view it.
Well, you've covered, touched upon the issue of hurt, and I actually sitting here reflecting that we probably didn't name the cause quite accurately, because we put resentfulness and hurt in brackets, almost identifying the two, which are not necessarily always the same, aren't they? Person might be hurt, but not necessarily will develop resentfulness, and won't change its his personality or her personality. Yeah. So how would you how would you distinguish between the two?
I would say that hurt is an ever-present route into resentfulness. So in a sense, resentfulness does not exist without hurt. But as you rightly said, hurt can lead to other reactions as well. So it's a route in, and it is strongly associated with resentfulness, but it's not. It is a distinct state as well. Yeah.
Okay, we've tried to grapple with the terminology, but obviously don't tell us everything from tomorrow's course. But what CBT can offer, or integrated CBT can offer to people who experience resentment and resentfulness?
Right. Okay. Well, the first step, and I think it is a crucial first step, as I've already highlighted, really, is that there is an awareness and a motivational issue that's actually around with this particular experience that people actually have. First of all, as I already mentioned, people are not necessarily and commonly aren't aware at all of the fact that they're feeling resentful. So part of what we'll look at tomorrow is about how we can actually explore that, whether that is actually a problem for the client, and how we can actually help the client identify whether this is something that they actually need to be working on. Secondly, there is, and I think that this is a general problem that's around with anger, but I think it's writ large with resentment, which is there is a big motivational issue around with it. And the reason why anger problems of all sorts tend to have big motivational problems is because they are seen, or they're basically emotional reactions to perceived injustice. To, if I've been hurt and I perceive that as being unfair, there's a real problem with this, because why the heck should it be me that does something about it? It ought to be the person who's hurt me that does something about it. Indeed, I might actually perceive it as being unfair in some particular way for you to be expecting me to see this as a problem. So there's a whole issue that's around with that. And not surprisingly, with resentfulness problems, blaming the other, and I mean that in the broadest sense, not just for the hurt, but also the responsibility for creating the change is pretty central. So there's a real issue here about how do you do that? You might actually get with the client, and the client might say, yeah, I am angry about what's actually happened. But it's not surprising, is it? I deserve to feel angry. It's not me that you should be working with. It should be this other person that's done this. And that's a real issue. But it gets worse, which is that the resentfulness that individuals feel following a hurt is something which gives a vicarious pleasure. When you're feeling hurt, sometimes the only thing you feel you've got is the comfort, basically, of feeling that you were in the right and the other person wasn't. Now, that means that that's quite a lot to let go of. And a lot of people have difficulty with that. So you might say, well, is that different really from anger? And the brief answer is yes, it is different, because with resentment, you have this problem that's around. And if I can just expand on this a little bit before, without giving too much of the game away tomorrow, because you are constantly reactivating the hurt by the rumination. If I can just give you what I remember being a very interesting example of this a number of years ago. I remember just after the peace process started in Northern Ireland, I went across to Belfast for the first time in years. I'd actually spent a short time in my childhood there, but I had no real memory of it. But I went back after the peace process started. And it was a time of hope and of optimism. And when I walked around a number of the areas in Belfast, I was very struck by the murals that were actually there, which were in many ways celebrations of the hurt and celebrations of the reminders of how there had been a reaction to these particular hurts. And I remember saying to somebody one particular evening while I was over there, gosh, this is going to be really interesting to see as the years go on, because I'd be very interested to see whether these particular murals, as they fade with time, will facilitate the fading of the resentfulness that's around in this community. And the person I was sort of commenting on this to said to me, you don't understand this, Paul. These particular murals are repainted every year to keep them fresh. And the thing I found, and do you see how it's going to be very difficult to escape rumination when you are constantly in a position of re-experiencing the hurt? It reminds me of a client that I had who had been divorced. I can't actually remember what she was originally referred for, but she'd been divorced. I think it was problems that she described as having anger. And she was very, very angry with her ex. And I remember in the first session her talking about this in great detail. And I said to her, how long ago did you break up? And she thought about it and she said about 18 years ago. And I remember at the time thinking to myself, how does somebody stay angry with someone for 18 years? And we were only in something like about the 4th or 5th session when I actually discovered that every evening this particular woman after work would go on her rowing machine at rowing machine at home. And in front of her rowing machine, there was a flip chart sized photo of her ex-husband propped up in front of the rowing machine. And that's where she would spend the first half hour to an hour after she got home. This sort of thing is interesting because it reactivates rumination. Now you might say, why would somebody want to remind themselves of the hurt that somebody caused them so many years ago? And the brief answer is that there is a very strange vicarious comfort. I can't really call it a pleasure, but a vicarious comfort from that continued process. So that creates a real difficulty, I think, with regards to motivation. Now, I'm not going to get into the detail of it now, but in terms of tackling resentfulness, there has to be a commitment to avoiding revenge. Revenge, I'm not saying that everybody who is resentful engages in revenge, they don't, but they find the idea of revenge very attractive. And they spend a lot of time very often fantasizing about it, and in some particular instances will engage in it. And it's one of those things, whether it's behavioral or cognitive, which feeds into and maintains the resentfulness. Obviously, not surprisingly, in terms of tackling this from a CBT perspective, there has to be quite a big focus on how you're going to help somebody tackle rumination. And the problem with rumination is it's intrusive and it feels for most people involuntary. They feel they can't stop themselves turning things over and over again in their head. So we'll be spending a little bit of time addressing that. And then we've got something else, particularly, can I say, for people who have been resentful for a long period of time, and where it's ended up shaping their identity in some particular way, which is, what are they going to replace it with? Because if you spend a lot of your time thinking and feeling this particular way, and particularly if it's ended up defining you and maybe has given you a sense of, I know this will sound strange, moral purpose or moral rightness in terms of the way you're thinking and feeling, if you're going to take that away, there's a real interesting question about what takes its place. And I'll be saying a little bit about the importance of helping people develop what are called downward social comparisons. I won't explain anything about that now, but it's been found to be an extraordinarily powerful process for helping people to develop well-being, and has particular relevance as an antidote to resentfulness. And we're also going to be at least touching to some degree on what is a very complex process of forgiveness. So putting all of that together, that will give you some idea of the sorts of areas that we're going to be looking at in more detail, and where I'll be going through some practical things that you can actually do in order to facilitate that with the clients that you work with.
How you're going to cover it all in 2 hours, I don't know.
We will manage it. We'll manage it.
Yes. Yeah. I wanted just to mention something to what you were saying before. Deborah made a comment: resentment and anger at everyone who is perceived as having been at fault is great protection from having to reflect on themselves, which is a very frightening prospect.
Yeah, undoubtedly. I mean, it's exactly the same as saying, it's much easier to say somebody else is to blame rather than to say that, because they basically, the implication of that is they're the one that should change. And you're quite right. It's much more scary and challenging when it's you that is seen as playing a role in this, in terms of the change process, not necessarily in terms of the cause, but certainly in the change process. And I think, I don't want to forget this. For a lot of people, it's also scary because it takes away what your identity may have been. Resentfulness can be all-consuming for some people, and if they're going to let go of that, it can be quite scary to know, well, what the heck is going to replace that? What way do I see myself now? And people get this very confused with thinking that it means having to forget things that are bad, or colluding with whoever it was that did the hurt, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's quite a scary thing for people, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Ian is asking, how do you think resentfulness is related to grief and loss?
I think that again, grief and loss is one pathway into resentfulness. And I think it goes in there really because we know, don't we, that anger is not an uncommon reaction to loss. And particularly when loss is seen as something which the person that we have lost, we perceive as having chosen in some particular way to cause it. And even when we know in our heads that they didn't choose it, there's still that sense very often that they shouldn't have done this. In other words, it's their fault. So to give you some obvious examples here, it's extraordinarily common, I think, for children who lose contact with, or just simply lose one parent from the household that they're living in, whether that's through separation or through death, to often feel resentful about that. We expect as kids, we expect adults to sort things out. So if an adult who I've relied on disappears in some particular way from my life and causes me hurt as a result of that, not surprisingly, I feel resentful. Now, I might know in my head that if this occurred through death, there was nothing they could do about it. But on the other hand, I've known instances where even that bit is where that's the case, that individuals have actually still ended up feeling quite blaming towards the person. I've known people, for example, to say, well, if he'd really loved me, he wouldn't have spent all of his life smoking. I've certainly come across clients who've said that. But there are other instances where it feels like there's a much more obvious active choice that the person's taken, which leads to that loss. So, you know, if my mum or my dad have decided to leave the home for another partner, for example, you know, from my perspective, particularly as a child, you know, I think to myself, well, they didn't have to make that choice. And partners obviously think that very often when they lose their partner in terms of a separation or divorce, they will often have that same thought. They didn't have to cause this hurt, but they've chosen to cause this hurt. And so again, we're back into that sense again of feeling hurt through being morally wronged in some particular way. So yeah, it's a very common process, yeah, in connection with loss and grief.
Thank you. Thank you. I can see Akash has his hand up. Akash, are you ready to ask your question?
Hi, Paul. How are you?
Hi.
It's a very new thing to me. Never read about it before. So one thing which I ended up concluding in a way, which could be very wrong, that this resentfulness can transform a victim into a culprit over a period of time.
Sorry, can you say that again? That resentfulness can
Resentfulness, and I think it can transform a victim into a culprit one day. So it's a very dangerous prospect.
Oh yes, I think that I think that's undoubtedly the case. And yeah, I mean that sort of raises another interesting point, really, which has to do, which I sort of very quickly touched on about this hot versus cold anger issue, really. The attitude that an individual has towards their anger, and if you see resentment as a subset or one particular expression of anger, people's attitude towards anger is one of the things that can often determine the way in which they behave in response to it. So if I, for example, see anger or see my resentfulness as something which is bad, which I wish to disown, which is not desirable in me, but I'm still feeling that particular way, then one of the things that often happens is that you get what are often seen as being out of the blue explosive expressions of that anger. So this is particularly common, can I say, in individuals that we would generally perceive as being quite passive and unassertive. And these are very often individuals who have been victims and have decided to internalize what's happened to them. But things get basically largely through the process of rumination, of turning things over and over and over and over again in my head. It gets to a point in some instances where individuals explode and they behave in a way which they themselves see as atypical of themselves and which other people see as atypical. You know, other people will say, you know, gosh, he seems such a mild-mannered person. I didn't ever expect him to behave that particular way. And some people do get quite explosive in that particular instance. Yeah.
Can we say, when you mentioned the fact that when it comes to resentfulness, it tends to become the part of your personality?
It can do, yes.
It can do.
And again, I don't want to suggest that all resentment exists in that way, but I think that in some instances, particularly through continuous rumination, I think that individuals start integrating it into how they see themselves as a person.
Yeah.
And they may actually have a sense of pride about it. They may actually say, you know, the fact that I hate this particular individual is actually a sign that I've not morally given up. and that actually I'm in a sense, it's a sign of my strength or my moral rectitude that I remain resentful, and that if I was to give up my resentment, somehow or other I would be a lesser person. I would be morally I would be morally incomplete in some particular way. And it's really the reason I mentioned earlier that motivation needs to be addressed very often before you start looking at things.
Exactly. I couldn't finish my point. What I wanted to say that in that case, once it becomes part of who you are, it becomes the essence of who you are once. And as I said, people start finding comfort and pleasure in it, because they have this sense that, we are right and people are wrong. The world is bad, because for whatever reasons whatever happened to them. So they find it difficult to replace that with something else, because they don't have anything else to replace it with in a way. So if people jump in, or counselors or therapists jump in, if they help them find a purpose in life, I think they can get rid of that resentfulness.
Yes, I'm saying yes. Without going into detail, I think it depends on what purpose. But broadly speaking, yeah, I would agree with you. Yeah.
So
thank you. I just need to move to the next question, Akash, sorry. Come to the course tomorrow, you might have more opportunities to ask more questions. I just wanted to finish with the question from Denise. Can strong resentment related to racism, nationalism, social divide, family breakup, bereavement, can it be recognized as resentment? So all these things, racism, nationalism, social divide, can the strong feelings towards that be recognized as resentment?
Well, I think that they all can be recognized as potential routes into resentment. And I think that for all of them, although these are obviously all very different events and experiences and circumstances, they all give rise and create particular beliefs, which in turn generate those particular feelings. So yeah, without a doubt. I don't want to oversimplify it and say that is what these things are solely about, but they're gateway. All of them are gateways into this as a problem. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. We are approaching 8 o'clock, and I know you need to have a break as well. So thank you very much, everyone. I've put the link to tomorrow's course several times. If you can come, we'll be very happy to see you. If you can't, still book, and we will send you the full recording. And thank you for your answers to my questions as well in the beginning. And now, as always, I just want to say thank you to Paul again, and to all of you. And you can unmute yourself and say your goodbyes, and we'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah, take care, folks. Look after yourselves.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Look after yourselves. Hopefully see lots of you tomorrow. You take care.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.